Variables. Before we dig in, just reminder on the help section, there's a whole series of pages on variables. There's a lot of things you can do with them. We're not going to cover every one of them today, but we'll go through several of them and talk through them. But they're broken down by type. So if you're grabbing data from a record, look at record variables. If you need user information, go to the user variables, team variables, things like that. So just keep in mind, good reference here. There's also a good reference in an article on our website, DocMgt.com/variable replacement. And you can just search for variable replacement too up here in the search bar. Talks about different types of variables, how to use them. We'll go over a lot of this today as well, but it's a good way to refer back to it later on. Okay, what are variables? Simply put, a variable is just some coded text. It's just plain text that gives the DocMgt server an instruction to do something. And 99% of the time, it's to retrieve some information. There are a couple calls you can make out, like with a REST call or things like that, that can actually update data, do things. But typically what you're doing is saying, I need some information, and you construct a variable to go get that for you. Okay. If you're looking for simple things like the time of day or the day of the week, things like that, we have a bunch of built-in variables just for things like that. So if we look at the date section, there's a whole bunch of variables here. But let me go through ways and show you how you can test and play and use variables. So first thing, if you're an administrator, you have in the admin dropdown a variable testing panel. Okay. And this test string up here allows you to play with these variables. So let's say I put in square bracket, date, square bracket. Now what this is doing, it's telling the server that because of the brackets, we're going to run a variable. Then the server will look in between the brackets and find out what variable you want. These are not case sensitive, just so you know, so you can type it uppercase, lowercase. Some people do camel paste, that's fine too. So it'll look and say, oh, what you want to do is get the current date. So if I type that in, hit run test, it returns back the current date. Okay. If I use a different variable, the time, okay, and it'll return back the time that your server is set to. So if your server is set to Central Time, it's 3:04. If it was set to Eastern Time, it'd be 4:04 right now. That's all in the admin section to set your time zone. Okay. If you need things like universal time, time UTC, it's actually 8:04 universal time. If you're interacting with the retention system and things like that, sometimes it's handy to be able to look at the UTC time to determine whether to do something. So most of the date variables have UTC alternates as well, right? Time UTC, date time UTC, things like that. Okay. So what a variable is doing, the server will look at this, parse out the middle and say, okay, what it really wants, the person, what we're asking for is the time in UTC format, and it'll return things accordingly. Okay. There's other things you can do, such as username. That'll return back the current user's username, user email, whole bunch of them. And we'll go, like I said, we'll go through several of these. Okay. So those are the simple ones. Okay, you have date, time, username, even the server URL, I believe, is a variable. So if you need to construct a full path to, let's say, a record, something like this, this will give you the server URL /v4/record, and then the record ID of whatever record you're in, okay, which now brings us to more of the record centric or the data centric variables rather than the system variables. So we call these system variables, date, time, username, things like that. Those are just kind of generally available no matter where you run them. But record ID is not something that's just floating in the ether. We don't know what record you're looking at. So if I were to run this, it would say /record/ where's my record ID? Well, I'm not in a record, so it doesn't know what record ID to give me. What we can do then, I may pull up a record here. This is record ID 22853. If I look at the variable testing, go to this test data panel and put in that record ID. Now the tester knows what record to look at. So when I run this again, it's actually going to return back, including the record ID. Now it has a record ID value to return back to me. So the other thing you can do with variables rather than just getting global variables and IDs, is I can look at this current record. There are a couple of variables in this record, sign date and signer name. So if I was to want to retrieve those values, now that I have a record I'm pointing to, I can do this. Signer name, John Doe. Okay. Same thing with sign date. Those are both values that are available to me. So if I'm in a record, or if I have a record in what we call in context, I can grab its values as well using variables. So whatever the field name is, not the field label, but the field name behind the scenes. That's why I always go to the raw data here to look. Whatever this field name is here, that's what you use to reference those data values. Okay. Now, one other thing you can actually do is you can concatenate variables together. It's just parsing a string. So the system's going to say, I need the signer name here and the sign date here. So when it replaces this, it comes back with name dash date. So if you ever needed to put together something in email, you can construct an email with a bunch of variables just by putting them in line. Hello, signer name. You signed this on. There you go. So you can use that to construct your emails, your merge templates, all sorts of things. All right. So grabbing raw values, you can grab the server level values, kind of the general ones. You can look at the record. There's all sorts of things, and we're not going to go through all these, but you could look at the number, you can get a count of the number of documents in the current record. You could get the category name of the first document, things like that. There's all sorts of things you can do in there. That's why I would definitely encourage you to just browse through, if you haven't already, all these variables that are available to you. Okay? A bunch of them in here. There's other variables, though, that can take parameters. So let's just say, let's say you have a date here, and I want to see what is the date 7 days from now. Okay, there's a variable called date add. Like I say, date add, and now I'm getting into a little bit more complex. I'm actually going to open up parentheses here at the end of the variable name, because this one expects for you to pass into it something to calculate. So what this is telling it is take this date and add 1 year to it. Look at that, 6/20/2024. So it's years, months, days, hours. Let's add 1 year and 4 hours to it. Okay. There you go. Or just 4 days, 1 year, 4 days. There you go. So date add is one of those we call a function variable. So the other ones were just data variables returning back simple values. Function variables actually allow you to manipulate things, such as adding dates. We could do mathematics. We have a math variable. I could go left of this string, give me the first 3 characters of the date, 6/2. So what happens is this date variable needs to be resolved first. So the system will actually go in and replace this first, 6/20/2023. Then it goes out and says, okay, what's the next variable to replace? Now it has this. So then it takes this string and takes the left 3 characters of it, okay, which is another very important aspect of this. You can stack what we call stacking variables. You can stack them inside of each other. When you get to these functional variables, they're expecting parameters. And what you want to do with them, such as the date adding method we did earlier, let's say 0 hours instead of 1 month. You don't know ahead of time what dates you want to add to. So that sometimes is also a variable. So you have to feed a variable into a variable. This comes into play when you're calculating. Maybe what we want to do is make every invoice that comes in due in 30 days. So I can say, take the invoice date, maybe there's an invoice date, add 30 days to that, and whatever comes out of it, that becomes our new due date. We can put that in a record. So you can actually update the due date field with something like this, and it'll set the due date field to whatever this calculates out to. Now, in this particular record, we don't have an invoice date, okay, that we're playing with here. So what I can do in the testing panel, I can go over to test data, and I can feed it a record ID, but I can also give it other values. Say, act like the invoice date is this value, so that when I test, this becomes 3/1/2023, and then it adds 30 days to it. That was wrong. 30 date add, and okay, 3/1/2023 invoice date. I typed something weird that doesn't look like the right date to me. Date add, invoice date, 1 year. See what happens with that. Okay. 0. Oh, it was 30 months. I put in 30 months instead of 30 days. So years, months, days. That looks better. So it's going to look in the current record. If it doesn't find that invoice date, it'll look over here, find an invoice date. And this is just for testing, right? So normally you're actually working against the real record. But sometimes you have to build that string here before you put it into workflow or before you put it into an add-in. So this testing panel becomes very, very helpful in being able to work out how to construct these variables. One thing, while we're in here in the testing panel, and most of you have used variables at some level in the past. What I wanted to show you is what we're adding into the variable selector. It used to be that you would drop this down and see a simple list of variables. Well, we've actually built that into more of a dictionary. So if you know you want to do something with dates, you just type in date here, and here's all the date-oriented variables. Right. Day of year. I could take that, put it up here, run it. Okay. 171. So today is the 171st day of the year. So a month start, that's another one I've been using a lot lately. Gives me the first day of this month. And the complement to that is month end. So those are very, very handy to have this. So all of the variable selectors inside of all the admin panels and all the workflow actions, those are all built out to this now in the next release. So you can actually get a list of everything, out of office stuff. There's all the out of office variables. So this is a nice improvement. I like this. And thank you to Chad here in our office for that idea. All right, one other thing that I wanted to show you while we're in the testing panel is it's very common. You'll be in a record like what we're doing here, and we wanted to test some variables against that record. And remember, I came in here, went to test data, typed in this record ID, right? The last record you go into actually shows up as a little button click. If I hit that, it puts in your last record ID for you. So instead of having to copy and paste or type it in, just hit that button and you get the last record ID for testing. A couple little new things coming out. I like this one. All right. Let's do a couple more examples and keep working up a little bit. So let's talk about one thing that comes up a lot is string manipulation of some form or fashion, all right? Where somebody has a delimited string. Let's say you get an invoice with a part number in it, or an invoice with some kind of codes in it, and maybe it's ABC-123-health-whatever, right? Whatever. And you need to get this string out of it. That happens quite a lot. So what we can do is we can actually use what we call our split command. These dashes are something that will help us. So what I can do is I can split this so that we're using a pipe in between every parameter on dashes and give me back the third one. Okay. So that's the first one, second one, third one, fourth one. So split it on dashes and give me the third one. Now, what if you needed to get the last one? You can reverse this a little bit and do a -1 on the number. And it starts counting from the end and works its way backwards. And now if I do -3 instead of 3, it'll count backwards. 1, 2, 3. I should get that back. So split is a very common, very, very common string manipulation variable to use. So I wanted to point that one out and show you some of the benefits to that one. Now this, once again, is probably not going to be something you're going to be able to hard code into your workflow or whatever. So this is most likely going to be another variable in here. So keep that in mind. So a lot of times what I'll do to test that is I'll kind of A23, ABC, XYZ, whatever. Okay. And then I will do hard code it, the next one, just so I can kind of keep things straight. A, B, C, X, Y, Z, right? Do this one, give me the second one, and then go to the next level so I can actually see line by line what's happening. First I get a string, then I split that string, and then I'm splitting that variable, which is this string. So I can test that by putting part number over here. There, run it. Oh, but I had a -3 there instead of a 2. So you can see that this is the full-blown variable. This would be one step before it where I manually put in the value. And this just is a reference for me to see the value ahead of me on top of this while I'm looking the variable. Now this will become more obvious next week when we get into workflow, but I'm going to show you just a quick sample of that where you could do just like with an add-in. I have a variable testing add-in down here. Okay. Let's do that same kind of trick. Let's split ABC 1, 2, 3 on dashes and give me the first one. Okay. And what I can do in an add-in, I can't really see the results of this because it's not going to update a record for me. So I'm just going to throw an exception. This is kind of a fun trick. What I'm doing in memory is I'm saying set a variable named total equal to this. Whatever this turns out to be, put it in this variable. And then I'm going to throw an exception in the button click in the add-in that says just throw an exception that has the value of that total in it so I can see what came out of it. I could have named it something like results, doesn't matter, just something I can refer to it with. Now if I go up here and run my variable testing, there's the result, ABC. So variables in testing mode is one thing, but seeing how you can actually set the result of a variable to something and then use it somewhere else. This is not very great example because you're not going to really use this anywhere, but I actually use this quite a bit for debugging. And most of you who've worked with me in the past, you'll call me up or email me and say, I can't figure out what's going on with this workflow action or this add-in. A lot of times I'll just say, well, throw an exception right after you think you set your values the way you want, throw an exception to show you what that value really is. Because sometimes what comes out of these isn't what you expect. All right. Or if it doesn't even make it to the exception and something else blows up, that tells you something too. It didn't make it past this last command. Because if you malform any of these, let's say I get rid of that last bracket, right? Then I try to run it. Now this one may or may not throw it, yeah. This one just returns back because I didn't have an ending bracket on it. It doesn't actually return the split. It returned back a string because I forgot that last bracket. That tells me something. I look at that and say, oh, that's what I did. I missed it. I'll look at it and go, oh, yep, sure enough, there's that extra bracket I need. All right, I just wanted to throw one quick example of using it inside of an action set or an add-in or something, just so you saw it there. Moving past that, let's do some other things. Another thing that's very common is having to look for empty values. So let's just say in this last record, let me go back to that record. Okay. Now, here I only have 2 values, but let's just say this was an invoice and I wanted to look at the total, right? If I was to do something like total, it'll come back with empty, nothing. Because in this record, which I'm in the right record, right? Yep, okay. There is no total. Right? Which might mess me up when I'm doing things like math or subtracting if the total is within a certain variance of the PO number or PO amount, something like that. I don't have a value there that might mess up my math. So what you can do a lot of times is if nulls is what we call it. Look at this value. If there's nothing that comes back, then replace it with this. Not that. There we go. So what's going to do is say, look at the result of this variable, total, which we already know is going to be empty. If it is empty, return back that. Otherwise, if it wasn't empty, it would return back whatever was in it. So now I could use that inside of a math statement, +1, but it won't blow up. It does a math. It says take whatever the total is, which is going to be 0 + 1. Now, if we had a total, I spelled it right. Okay. Now I run that variable. Now I get 101 because this time I actually found a total. So that if null is going to return back 100, not 0. So math is used quite a bit, but the big thing about empty values can actually throw you for a loop, because sometimes you're expecting a value there, but it doesn't always exist. Maybe it's either a timing issue, or maybe somebody uploaded an invoice without a value, something, who knows? You just never know what's going to happen. So defend yourself a little bit with the if null. That'll help you a lot. Other things we do a lot is, well, the if statement. Let's blow a whole if out here. It might be something where if total is greater than 100, and return back too large, otherwise say too small. Okay. Just break it down. Total is a number that's going to be replaced. This is the operator, greater than, whatever value you're going to compare it to, too large, too small. And since total is 100, it comes back too small. But if you're looking at greater than 99, too large. So whatever the true is and whatever the false is. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through every one of these variables, but there's a logic section. This talks about the if statement. Okay, and here's all the available operators: equals, not equals, less than, greater than, less than, equal to, greater than, equal, et cetera. So you can do it between as well. So if that is actually between 0 and 99. So a lot of options there. If and if null are both very powerful, used quite a bit. A lot of times what you'll get into, especially if you're doing merge documents, like, because we can merge data into Word documents, PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, things like that. When you want to check a checkbox off, for instance, in a PDF, you can code the checkbox to say be a checked or non-checked value. Basically, it's a true or false. Well, if the value you want to check on is something like this, a total, if the total is greater than 100, sorry, hit the wrong key there. If total is greater than 100, then I want to check it on, else check it off, do something like this. And the PDF merging will look at false and say, oh, I should not check this checkbox. Whereas if it went like this, it will check the checkbox. So you can use these inside of the merge documents as well. And I know several of you have done this already. But sometimes it's not quite as obvious on how you can use the variables until you've seen a few examples. I just want to throw some of these out at you. Now, let's get into a little bit more of, we're just going to keep going a little bit more advanced, okay? So right now we've seen how you can grab like the signer name out, right? So I could do over here, change this to signer name. Do that one, okay? John Doe. What if there's multiple signers? Well, let's find out. Now we have multiple signers. Do our testing. Look at that. It just happened to find one out of the blue, right? And basically what happens is it's typically alphabetical. So it'll grab the first one that finds in alphabetical order with the signer name on it. Now, what if you need multiple signers? Now, there are ways of doing things like this. So for instance, we have a join command. Join whatever's in the signer name field with semicolons. There you go. What if you need to know how many are there? Field count of signer name field. 3. Okay, now I want to find each one of them one at a time. I don't do this one very often. I'm actually going to look this one up. Field, there it is, field delimited. Field delimited, signer name. Give me the first one. And then we'll do second one and third one. There you go. So to relate this to workflow add-ins, things like that, and then you can do a loop action where you loop this many times, and then each loop you would grab the next item using the loop counter or the loop item counter, with loop action counter, whichever type of loop you're using. And the loop counter is actually another variable that's available inside the looping actions. And I'll show you examples of this next week. So that's how you could say loop this many times, and then each one grabs the next one from the loop. I already talked a little bit about math, but let's do a little bit more of that. 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3 plus 3. Math, it does a simple parsing. It doesn't do anything crazy. It's not going to do scientific notation, anything like that, but all the basics are covered. 1 plus 2 times 3, so that should be 7, I believe. Yeah, because its order of precedence happens. So multiplication happens before addition or subtraction. So keep in mind, if you wanted to do 1 plus 2 times 3 this way, you just wrap it in parentheses. Bears all the same characteristics as normal math functions. So math is another one we use quite a bit. And if we look at the number variables, there's difference, which is another one we do quite often as well. Minimum, maximum, counting, averaging. So go through this. Like I said, it's kind of fun to look at all these options. Oh, autonum. That's one that slips under a lot of people's radar. So I thought I'd mention that as well. We have an autonum system where you can have a sequential numbering system based on name that are completely independent. So I know I don't have a numbering system for ABC. So if I run this, it's going to create a new numbering system for ABC, and it's going to seed it with number 1 first. Every time you run it, it comes back with the next one available. Okay. If I just do this with autonum, you can do autonum exist, autonum reset. You could say reset that to 10,000. Okay. Now if I do autonum, start to 10,000, works its way up from there. So autonum, very powerful. It's much better than the auto ID system that we used to have. Still there, auto ID. Auto ID is just the record ID. Whatever record you're in, that is the ID that gets assigned. Okay, so it's still unique, but it's not necessarily sequential. Whereas the autonum, you control it. You can call it from anywhere. It's not tied to any record data variables. Right? You just give it a name that makes sense. All right. Like in this case, I'd just use ABC. A lot of times you'll say invoice or purchase order or something like that. PO would be a good one. Then if you're generating POs in the system, it'll just automatically give you the next available number every time you call it. Guaranteed to be unique. And it's sequential. Even if you don't save this value anywhere, that value 10,001 or 10,003 is never going to be used again for this sequence, unless you reset it, of course. So be careful with that. Where else can you use variables? Okay, we've talked a little bit about the add-ins, workflow. Like I said, we'll go through a lot of that. Essentially, anywhere that you can run an action, be that in the admin, the workflow, any of the button clicks, retention, anywhere like that, any place like that, you can use variables. But you can also, which a lot of people don't know, is you can do it in the searching too. So let's just say in our invoices, right? Let me do a quick search so I know what data I have to play with. All right, so let's say invoice date. Perfect. All right. So if I wanted to look at everything in December, I could just type in invoice date of, go back to December of last year. I could say, give me everything from the 1st to the 31st of December last year. Let's search. Okay. Nothing crazy. There's all the ones from December. You can use variables in place of hard-coded dates or anything as far as that goes. The dates make more sense for me. So what I can do is I can say, give me everything date minus, I'll just do 90 days, right? Up until today. Hit search. There you go. Everything from 323, whatever, to 620. So that was apparently 90 days ago. Okay. I could have done the full date add thing here too. Date minus or whatever, date plus. This is just a shorthand for number of days. I could do the whole thing, date add, date, whatever. Doesn't matter. However it resolves, whatever variable you want to use to resolve to a date will work. Right. Now the bonus of doing this, I know we talked a little bit about this in one of our searching earlier boot camps on basics, is that you can now have a search that you can save last 90 days invoicing. Okay. Now, anytime I run that, this date variable and this date variable are going to be evaluated at the day that they're run. So if I run this tomorrow, I'm actually going to get things from 323 to 621. So whenever I execute that search, those variables will be reevaluated. So now you could give someone a search, say a CEO or a CFO, a search of all the invoices that are maybe due dated in the next 30 days, right? By going down here, notice what I did to be able to do the variables is you click this little middle button, starts out with a date picker, right? Which is down here. And if I click it again, it goes to variable where I can type in whatever I want. I do it one more time and I can do comparisons. I'm not going to go through all this now, but to get to the variable section, just click it once so you can type in whatever you want. So variables can be very handy in this context as well. And you're not limited to just dates. It's just an easy example to show, right? You could also do PO numbers with a data variable if you wanted to. Depends on how the data is structured. You can also do it even in the entry side too. Now this doesn't happen, normal users wouldn't do this typically, but you could actually put in the date as an invoice number if you wanted to. Whenever I save this record, that will be evaluated and the date bracket date would be replaced with the actual date back, okay? So if I go back to that last record I was in, this test record, when I do my raw data, I can put in test date, username. So the date and the username. Save. Look at my data. There it goes. Date dash username. So it works there as well. Which is really handy because the other aspect of system in general is the eForms, where in the eForms you can default values of an eForm field to a variable, which means that whoever loads that form, it's going to load that form under their context. So if I'm using a username field, it can put their username in a hidden field or a dropdown or something like that. So variables become very powerful on the eForm side and the workflow side. It's just kind of spread throughout the whole system. If I wanted to, I could even use variables in the field name. Not sure if that's practical, but let's try it. Date equals time. I don't know. There we go. Okay, date equals time. Let's say that I wanted to save another field that had values from this field in it. So I could say take test number test 2. Let's call it test 2. And I want to make this combination of test and total. Okay, so it should have this and this in it. When I look back at test 2, there you go. So that's a one-time shot though, because I did that myself. I typed in test plus total and got this full string. I could have done that in the record type definition on an auto calculate field, and then every time that record loads, it recalculates whatever's this and this together and puts them into one field. We do that quite often for summaries and other things. So variables are really powerful. I said you pretty much sprinkle them anywhere you need them. And if you find a place where variables aren't getting evaluated, let me know and I'll see if it's someplace we can. We typically try to make the variable system available to every single part of the system that's possible. So another thing I wanted to demonstrate with variables, which is another thing that comes up quite often, somebody uploads a bunch of documents and forgets to fill in something. Or let's say that the customer calls back and says, oh, I need to put concatenate these two fields together or something silly like that. You could do some kind of a match and merge update with importer that does a remassages the data, all that stuff too. But if it's a smaller job, and what they want to do is maybe concatenate these two fields into another field, something like that, you could actually do that right in the entry screen. And this is going to, just real quick here, let's say I want to select all those. I just did a Control A here, select all, check all. Hit edit, check records, and I can do something similar here. I'm just going to make up a fake name, test field. Then I'll put in what fields we had to play with. Vendor ID, bracket, and then let's say I want to do that, semicolon, what's another field? I could pick amount. I don't know. Nonsensical, but oh well. So now I'm going to actually put a new field in there. All these records I checked that has a combination of its vendor ID and amount separated by semicolon. Hit that, just rolls through, update, update, update. I go in to look at one of these. Edit it. We don't have a field name test, so it's not going to show up here. But if I go to my raw data and look for the test field, where's it? There it is, right here. There we go. There's your vendor ID and your amount concatenated together. So that's a very practical use of the variables, being able to help you out. You can calculate, due dates based on invoice date that way as well. Like I said, you can do it automatic in workflow or in add-ins, or you can just do it right in line in the search and update, edit checked records. While we're here, I do want to show one other feature coming out since I have you all here. If you look at the options, there's actually something called Show Action Bar. Okay, doesn't do anything until you check one of these records on. Okay, so now instead of having to go over here and pick an action, you can actually have them up here for you. Now I can hit Edit here instead of having to always do the drop downs. And you can. The cool thing is you can pick which features to put there. And when you don't have
those settings saved for the next time you open that?
Yeah. All right. 20 minutes left. I'll pull up an invoice. It should have line items in it. Make sure. Oh, yeah, several. Good. It's a big one. All right. So what Dave's talking about, and this is something that happens quite often if you're doing invoice matching, line item matching to purchase orders, things of that nature. You may have to go down to the line item level. So that's a great way to look at it. So let's just talk about how first you get to the line items. Okay. So let me go to my variable tester, and I'm going to say, use this current record I'm in because I know I have line items. There's actually a line item variable. LI is shorthand for it, and I think it's called line items full, but I use the LI. It's just simpler, takes up less space. So if I just do that by itself, nothing else, I'll get a list back in JSON, collection of all of the line items. Okay. Which can be helpful at times. Typically, you'll break it down some more. So what I would usually start with is a line item count. There's 15 line items in this record, and there's all the line items there. So now what if I wanted to look at the first line item? I can say, okay, LI1. Okay. One didn't have a lot of data in it. I noticed that too. It was empty pretty much over here. Let's go to line item 2 just so we have more information. Okay, so there's everything about line item 2. The amount, description, invoice line all, which is something that we pull out for helping. And then a bunch of things like the description, the quantity, the unit price, all that. Now, if you know what field you need from line 2, that's another parameter in the LI or line item variable. Go to pipe, and I'm going to go amount. Okay, so that's the amount from line item 1. And of course, if I needed 2 or 3, just change the line number. There you go. Another thing that's fairly common is you want to get a total of all the line items. Okay? You can do like a sum command of all the line items. Now, I'll deal with that one a little bit later because that takes a little more massaging, but you can do things like that. Okay? Now, that's good by itself. Now, if you're doing a loop, though, like in Dave's question, I know kind of where he's going with this stuff. I've worked with him on these before. What you probably end up doing is doing a line item loop action type. Okay. Now the line item loop will take you from line item to line item to line item, and it uses a variable called line counter. Sorry, line counter. Okay. That will hold the number of the line you're currently on. So instead of saying line number 4, I would put that here. It goes back to our stacking that we were talking about before. Now for testing, I'm going to set a test data variable called line counter, and I'm going to assume line 4. Now when I run it, I should get the same value because I'm still looking at line 4 right here. But in practice, the line item looping action will do that for you. It'll have that available to you. So the 4th time through, it'll be number 4. Now, if you needed to, let's say you wanted to loop through and total up all of the values from that. Now, you could use that sum command like I was talking about, but inside of the looping, you're already looping. You can just start building up a total. Right? So maybe you'll have a field called line total. Right? There we go. I want to build that up one at a time. So what I could do in every loop is I could do a math of whatever's in the line total field, using brackets there, plus whatever's in the current line's amount. Right? And every time it looped, it would just keep adding this all together. And we got to make sure we assign the result of this to a field called line total so that every time it looped, it kept adding. Okay, so let's just say we also have a line total starts with 100. We should get 900. Oh, sorry, but we already have a problem here. The line amount has dollars in it, dollar sign in, which is a problem. So I have to use a decimal around it. Real world stuff here. I don't know if you noticed what I did. Let me just go back and show you here. If we look at the line total, the line amount, okay, it has a dollar sign on it. If you try to do math with dollar signs, that messes it up. So what you can do is, once again, using another function, we have one called decimal. So I wrap this entire line item amount thing inside of a decimal, which strips all the non-numeric characters out of the string. And what that returns me, if I run that by itself, is the same value, but without the dollar sign. Now I can take that and use that inside of a math. So very real world case of having to stack multiple variables on top of each other. Okay. And then if I want to, at the end, I could actually do another format and put the dollar sign back on if I wanted to, see for currency. There you go. It's very literal, so that's why I like to do it like I'm showing here. Take it to start with the basic, wrap it with one thing. Remember, you got to have those parameters, the parentheses and brackets around everything. Then do the next piece, and then do the last piece, so you can actually see it build on each other. And anybody who's done any kind of scripting, programming, stuff like that, this probably is fairly normal. But it's really nice to just break it down piece by piece like this way. Oh, yep. This usually is, Dave, this is what everybody falls down on, even me. I mean, I'll get rushing through here and I'll forget this last parentheses or forget to close off that last bracket. Or like I've done several times here, I accidentally had the shift key down and did a curly brace instead of a square bracket, right? But if you run those, typically you go, whoa, what happened there? And then you can see, oh, okay, that was it. It's usually pretty obvious. That's why I like this tester, because if you just try to put all this freehand into workflow, you've got to run the whole workflow to see if it works. And a lot of times you don't get that immediate feedback. So anytime I can use my test records and my test data here to do it, so much the better. Now, another thing I want to go to, and this will be very important when you start using workflow and add-ins, basically alternate records. That's a tricky one, because in the workflow, you can have a record in memory. Let's say you're routing an invoice, right? You got the invoice going through. I can use all my square brackets to grab my dollar amounts, my vendor IDs, all that stuff. Everything's peachy. But then I get to a point where I have to do a search to see if there's a purchase order that matches the PO and the invoice. So I do a search and update, or search and run actions. Let's use that one because that one's more of a context breaker. I do a search and I find the purchase order over there. And then in the search and run actions, which we will go over in our session next week, essentially what it does is it'll go do a search for anything you tell it to. And for every record it finds, you can run a series of actions on. Okay. So, and I'll just actually, let me go ahead and bring it up so I can have something visual for you to look at. Maybe I'll just do an add-in. Let me do an add-in here. Okay. Variable testing add-in. Get rid of that, get rid of that. Okay. So we're going to do a search and run action. Okay. Search and run action. There we go. Let's just say I want to search for a purchase order, PO, where PO number equals, and I don't have one in front of me, but let's just add an invoice with had a PO number field in it. Okay, so I want to see wherever the purchase order's PO number equals the invoice's PO number. See the use of the variables there. Now at this point, the only record we have in memory is the invoice. So the square bracket over here is going to refer to the invoice record. Now, when I get to actually running actions, these actions happen on the purchase order record, the one that I found. Okay. So now if I wanted to update the purchase order something field, right, I could just do this and I could update this field to this value. No big deal. The problem becomes, let's say I wanted to update the PO invoice number. Maybe there's an invoice number in the purchase order. Could happen. I could then use the invoice number from the invoice here. But the current record in memory now is the purchase order, not the invoice anymore. So the invoice number field here is going to try to read from the purchase order. Well, we don't have it there yet because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put it there. All right, so we actually have two records we care about at this point. The invoice we came from that started the search, and the purchase order that we're running now that actually is inside the action loop, these actions here. So to get to the current active record, you use the square brackets, which is what we've been doing already in our examples. The alternate record, which actually, because of the way the search and run actions work, the one that started the search becomes your alternate while you're in here, not the active. The active is going to be your purchase order. But what I can do for alternates is one slight modification, put your angle brackets in there, and that will tell the system to look at the alternate record if it's there, which in this case it will be because it's coming from the invoice record. So context is something that's tough to grasp sometimes, but when you actually use it and walk through it a few times, it's not too complicated. It's just hard to keep it straight sometimes. So in this case, like I said, the invoice started this whole thing. It did the search. You still have the invoice at the search level. So while I'm constructing this little search panel, this is coming from the invoice. But once you get into the actions, you're actually acting on the purchase order record, or multiple. It could be one record, multiple records. Now, whenever I do an update, I'm updating with this action here, record field, I'm updating the purchase order, not the invoice. And to get the invoice data, I have to use the angle bracket syntax. So alternate record and active record is a very important concept, especially anytime you're doing loops, these search and updates, search and run action sets, all those. You almost always have two items in memory, the alternate and the active. Okay. Now, once I get done with this action loop and I'm out of here and I come out of this action, now the invoice is back to the active record. Okay. You don't normally have to manually change context. It does come up occasionally, but there is an action to set the context, the current record in memory. If you start using that, let me know though, because usually there's a better, easier way to manage what you want to do. But sometimes it's necessary. So active versus alternate. Anytime you do a search and something else, you're gonna get into that. Search and update, search and create a CSV, which that one really doesn't. Search and calculate, search and create, search and run action sets, search and run actions. All of those are going to have some kind of an alternate record, one way or the other.
Am I wrong to think that squiggly brackets also are used for alternate? Or is that only like with temp records?
I think we did have kind of for backwards compatibility, I believe the curly braces still work. But we're trying to go to the angle bracket. So anytime you need to, just use the less than greater than. Yeah, there's some syntax was a little different way back, and we have to keep some of that for backwards compatibility, but we don't train on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How are we doing on time? 4 minutes. All right. Well, this is a good primer to get everybody ready for the workflow one. That's the boot camp that's coming up next week. That you're going to use pretty much everything I've shown you here. You will use with even the, easy, what you quote unquote easy workflows, with the exception of maybe the line item stuff. That one you usually get into with the heavier stuff, but it can happen. Well, we're going to get into all these action types and how to manipulate workflow, how to get through workflow. Without the variables, it becomes very difficult because you need to be able to grab that information, compare information, and it's just, if we didn't have a variable system, it would just be a real pain. And because the variable system is so flexible and you can use it in so many places, it just made sense to allow it to happen. So you can really use them about anywhere. We can merge data into spreadsheets. We can merge data into Word documents, PDF files. Every time you can merge data anywhere, those variables can be used. So it's nice to get a feel for how they work. When you, and I would encourage everybody to start playing with it if you haven't already, get in and use that variable tester and just start with the basics. Go down the list of all these and just run them and see what you get. This delete one, for anybody who hasn't done this yet, this is one that's kind of really only usable when you're updating a value of a field or a record. You can delete the value. This won't do anything anywhere else, just so you know. Some of the stuff like the color, the branding colors, if you want to use the branding colors somewhere, all right? So give you back the hex code of all the branding. So if you code some of your stuff to use that in your eForms, then as you copy an eForm from one site to another, make building templates, it'll just take on their colors.